and welcome back to what I'm calling the temporarily final. Yes, we'll go with that. The temporarily final episode of Saturnmania. I've been playing exclusively the Sega Saturn, going over some of my absolute favorite games for this system. The Saturn is up there. It's somewhere in my top 10 favorite systems of all time list. No question about it. I just started with the Saturn because lately I've been playing a whole lot of it thanks to the Saru, which is just a wonderful little device, an inexpensive way to play all these wonderful Saturn games that now cost stupid, idiot amounts of money to buy them physically. So that is what that is. And that's a shame, though, because for a long time, the Sega, no one cared about this thing. The Sega Saturn was just kind of, everyone saw it for what it was, and let's be clear, let's be straight about this. The Sega Saturn was a failure. It came out in 1995 and it was all wrapped up, midway through 1998. So that's a 3-year run. And Sega ran away from this thing in America and ran right into the loving embrace of the Dreamcast, which had its own issues, which I'm sure we'll talk about one day here when we play my 5 favorite games on the Dreamcast. But in the last 10 years or so, the Sega Saturn has really kind of turned a corner in the retro games hobby and has been rediscovered or discovered by so many people, and that has led to this once cheap, forgotten system to becoming one of the most expensive systems to collect for, which I mean, it's good if you own a bunch of Saturn games, no question about it, because now you have something that's worth a ton of money, at least for now. It's bad, though, if you are a person that really enjoys playing, real deal physical games on real hardware, and you want to just play The Crow City of Angels for some bizarre, unknown reason. But if you want to do that, you're going to spend $300 on trash. Let's be clear. There's so many Saturn games that are expensive that are terrible. The Crow City of Angels is one. Batman Forever is another one. That game is so bad. And yet, if you want to own it for your collection, you're going to be spending hundreds of dollars. You do what you want to do with your money. I will stick to the Saru because boy, oh boy, does it get the job done. But yeah, that's kind of the state of the Saturn, is that it is, I think it's now become this kind of retro gaming darling. And that's for good reason. There is for a failed console, there's a ton of treasure out there, pun intended, because there's treasure games on there. Talking Radiant Silvergun, talking Guardian Heroes. But yeah, there's a lot to look into when it comes to the Saturn. In the global library, obviously, the U.S. library is smaller than the Japanese one. In my opinion, all the real magic is on the Japanese library. But with something like a Saru, you have access to all of it. You just have to know where to look, and that's easy enough to do. And as a side note, with the Saru, I personally have only run it. So I think on the SD card I have it on mine, I've installed 151 games so that it shows 150 on the list because they count 0, which is adorable. But of the games I have on here, only 3 of them don't work. The rest of them work absolutely perfectly. And I haven't really I've had some hangs. I've had some moments where I was playing a game and it just kind of froze and I have to get up and waddle over to the system and push power. With a recent update, you can now reset back to the menu and pick another game, which I think I might show off here just because it's that convenient. But this is it's open source. The guy who made the Saru has kind of opened up people to help him work on it. So it's just going to improve and get better over time. And the most recent firmware, like I said, is 0.5. So they haven't even hit a 1.0 on their firmware. So it's really just, onwards and upwards from here. And what they have right now is fantastic. And you can buy it on eBay. You can buy it on AliExpress. I got mine on eBay just because it's more convenient for me to do that. But what you want to look for is what are called the Elite editions. And those ones all have new chips. This runs on a particular FPGA chip, some Altera chip that is getting harder to find. Although I think recently I believe I read somewhere that there was like a whole new supply was found or something. Anyway, some of these Sarus have like donor chips, aftermarket chips, and you can tell because like the logo on the chips has been sanded down. Those ones I've heard run, pretty bad and are pretty prone to, errors and being faulty. These Elite ones, which I have here, it's like a clear plastic. They all have new chips. Everything in there is new. And I've put this thing through its paces, and I haven't had major issues yet. Now, granted, I haven't sat there and played through all of the Shining Force series or all of Deep Fear or something like that. Really put a lot of hours on this, but I've sat there and played many, half hour to an hour sessions, and nothing bad has happened. I will say the SD cards, you got to be careful. You got to make sure you're using a legit SD card of a name brand, because the first one that I got corrupted in the first day, and I think it was because it was a bootleg SanDisk, which is a shame. If you buy SanDisk stuff off of Amazon, you're really rolling your dice there, because they're not only are they bootleg, but like they're really convincing bootleg. Like you can hold one next to a real one in the packaging, and it's really hard to tell. There are little signs, but do your research on that. I have a verified official SanDisk 128 gig card in mine, and I haven't had any issues with that. And I've seen people use Samsung online and no issues there. So just those two brands off the top of my head, I think are the way to go. I'm sure there's others that work well too. But anyway, back to Saturn. I'm going to wrap up this 5-pack of Saturnmania. And like I said, I might return to this down the road and do 5 more games. Because there's a lot to love on the Saturn. There really is. But this last one I'm going to do is one of the big dogs. And it is one of the few Saturn exclusives of the era that remained exclusive. It only finally got a port, maybe 10 years ago on the 360 and on PlayStation 3. Although, now that I think about it, there was a Japanese exclusive PS2 port of this. But, it's hard to get. If you lived in America and you had a Saturn, and this game was a second wave pack-in game where Sega was so desperate of trying to sell Saturns that they launched a version that came with 3 games. It was Virtua Cop, it was Daytona USA, and it was this game, Virtua Fighter 2, that we're going to be playing today. And I wanted to show this game off. Number one, it is one of my favorite Saturn games. I do honestly think it is one of the best fighting games ever made, and still holds up today. But it really shows off what the Saturn is capable of as a piece of hardware if the developers knew what they were doing with it. And obviously Sega knew what they were doing with it. Excuse me. Because they made the thing. They put all the money and made this fucker. So of course they would know about it. Now there's stories online about Sega of America and Sega of Japan, for whatever reason, they couldn't work together. And that really did lead to the downfall. One of many factors. But one of the bigger factors of what led to Sega departing the hardware business was just that Sega of Japan and Sega of America could not get their shit together and figure out a way to work together cohesively for the greater good. And this is an example of that. You look at Virtua Fighter 2, obviously in-house Sega Japanese development, and there's several other games on the Saturn, like Baroque is one I can think of, came out in Japan only. Dead or Alive on the Saturn. And these games they're 3D games. They look incredible. They ran at 60 frames a second. I don't think Baroque did, but obviously Virtua Fighter 2 does, and Dead or Alive does. And they're unbelievable. Like you wouldn't even, aside from Virtua Fighter because it's a Sega house brand, like if you didn't know that, you wouldn't, it'd be hard. I don't think you would know right away that it was a Saturn game. That's how good it looks. So let me go ahead and do this. Let me do this. And we're at the Saru menu. And actually I'm going to do this. Let's load Virtua Fighter 2. And I do want to show off this feature of the Saru before I get into Virtua Fighter 2 gameplay. So let's do this. And let me turn the sound on so we have a little background Virtua Fighter sound here. So I'll pick Pi and we'll just start doing our thing here. We'll just start bata 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 bata. We're playing, and let's just say I'm sick of playing this game, which I would never say because it's excellent. But I'm gonna go ahead and push A, B, and C and start at the same time. I'm going to do it one more time, A, B, C, and start at the same time. And now we're at this menu, and now I'm going to push just the start button, and now I'm back here. And I can select another Saturn game. So imagine, if you will, you're on your couch playing your Saturn, upscaled on your big-ass 4K TV, and you have a wireless controller, or you have another means, like maybe extension cables. The fact that you can do this and play different games as easily as this on a Saturn is so badass and so convenient and so cool. So yeah, that is the Saru difference. But you do have to have the most recent firmware to do that. All right, let's get into Virtua Fighter 2. And I'm going to make this big for me so I can enjoy it. All right, it says down there 1995 Sega. That's when the arcade version came out. I believe Virtua Fighter 2 came out in 1996. And so I was talking earlier about that 3-pack of pack-in games. That came out during the holiday in which the Saturn was competing not only against the PlayStation, but it was competing against the N64, which the N64 was the unknown. Everyone predicted it to be this huge juggernaut. And that first year it was. Don't get it twisted. The N64 was like the hot toy of that Christmas. It was impossible to get. And Mario 64 was also impossible to get. Obviously, the bloom washed off that rose in intervening years. And the N64, you know, a lot of people love it. A lot of people think that it is fairly overrated. I am more in the latter camp than I am in the former, although there's certainly games I love on the N64. But anyway, yeah, Sega was so desperate, they packed in this game and 2 others in order to compete with those 2 systems. And it was only $199. So it was actually like a really, really good value. Let's be honest. But at the end of the day, it didn't do enough. All right, let's pick. I do like my boy Wolf because he's a wrestler. He's a wrestler. Okay, so let's talk about the character models first and foremost. They are textured. Obviously, Virtua Fighter 1, no texture. There's a lot of polygons on these models, especially when you compare it to other Sega Saturn games and other even PlayStation games. But I know I'm not going to sit here and say that these look like, you know, Dreamcast or PS2 models. They don't. But they sure as shit look better than Battle Arena Toshinden, like all day, twice on Wednesday. And to me, as someone who can certainly stomach old 3D games, I think this game holds up visually incredibly well. And a lot of the heavy lifting there is the fact that this game runs at a lock-solid 60 frames a second. Virtua Fighter, the series, has always been like a fun, button-mashy kind of fighting game. But I think what really sets it apart, well, 2 things really set it apart. It's the realism, and it's the fact that this is like the definition of a game that's easy to pick up and play and difficult to master. You can watch people play Virtua Fighter games, any one of the 5 and the offshoots, and it's like watching Rembrandt do a painting. Like, it's amazing how good people can be at Virtua Fighter. And in Japan, this game in particular, Virtua Fighter 2, was a monster. And they were selling V8, you know, like professionally done and packaged retail VHS tapes of people just playing Virtua Fighter 2 at a high level. I remember on Virtua Fighter 4 for the PlayStation 2, so it was Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution, there was all these unlockable videos of a guy, and the view is like bird's eye view of an arcade console. So you saw the stick and the buttons, and the guy was playing super high level Virtua Fighter with one hand. So thumb on the joystick, and you know, index, ring, and middle finger on the buttons. And it's just, what are you doing, you magician? Like, the fact that you would spend the time to do that and get good at it, to me, is marvelous. But yeah, you hear stories about arcades in Japan where, so famously, and I've been lucky enough to visit Japan twice, and I got to go to the major Club Segas before they closed. But I didn't get to go in the 90s. My first trip to Japan was in 2003, so kind of the tail end of this. But you hear stories of, you know, the big Club Sega in Akihabara, that there would be one entire floor of the arcade that was dedicated to Virtua Fighter 2. So just to put that into perspective, you know, like that's just not how arcades were for us. Even at the biggest peak, you know, you had certainly when Street Fighter 2 led the resurgence of arcade games in America. Big arcades definitely had, you know, rows of Street Fighter 2 cabinets, but they didn't have a whole floor, like a whole dedicated floor of just Street Fighter. Although if they did, that would have been fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna pick another character, so I'm gonna let the continue screen wear out. Mash the buttons here to make that go faster. Is that a thing? It sure is. When I went to Japan the first time, that big Club Sega in Akihabara, they had a whole floor dedicated to one soccer game. That was kind of cool. Of course, I don't give 1/2 of a fuck about soccer, but the fact that that was a thing is cool. Let's pick Shun. So, real quick, Virtua Fighter 1, you had these characters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Virtua Fighter 2 just added these two guys, Shun and Lion. But everybody got a ton more moves, and the biggest deal obviously was the graphics, the graphical upgrade. Virtua Fighter 2, the arcade game, oh boy, that thing, what you want to talk about a jump. You look at Virtua Fighter 1 in the arcade and Virtua Fighter 2 in the arcade, and it is insane, like how much of a difference in graphics those games were. Really cool stuff. And then Virtua Fighter 3, which is kind of like the forgotten Virtua Fighter. They did some weird stuff with it, like Yu Suzuki was experimenting with upper ground stuff. So meaning like the stages had tiers to them. So like you could be fighting on an upstairs part of the stage downwardly towards your opponent. And if you were the one who had the high ground, you had an advantage. And I think that's a neat idea on paper, but in practice, it's not that good. But I think graphically, that game came out in '97 in the arcades, and that was the first time anyone ever saw like what was, you know, what you would consider a 128-bit game. So like PS2, GameCube, Dreamcast, that kind of stuff. And I remember seeing the first time and only time I ever saw Virtua Fighter 3 in the arcade. There's a level with snow, and when you walk around the stage, like the snow would deform under your feet, and I just thought that was absolutely incredible. But yeah, I think for a lot of people, Virtua Fighter 2 is like especially at the time. Things have changed now because more and more people have been exposed to the Japanese Saturn games. But at the time, Virtua Fighter 2 was your bragging rights game. Like, yeah, over on PlayStation, you had Final Fantasy VII, you had Metal Gear Solid, you had all those things. N64, you had your Mario 64s, Star Fox 64, you know, later on, Zelda Ocarina of Time. Saturn, you had this game. And for people who love 3D fighting games, you know, this is really up there. It's one of the best. Still to this day, it's so fun to play. You can still you can play this online on the 360 version, which you can still buy on Xbox. Not that long ago, I had a friend of mine and I were online playing it together, and we had some other people just randomly show up and play, which is, you know, for a game that's coming up on 30 years old. I think next year, Virtua Fighter 2, the arcade version, turns 30. That's kind of cool. The fact that people are still out there enjoying it. And there's a lot to enjoy, to be honest. So I think a thing that is take it or leave it. People, you know, either hate Virtua Fighter because of this, or, you know, to be honest, I don't know too many people who love this. But the jumping in Virtua Fighter is weird. It's very slow. You jump very high. It's very, very slow. I don't understand the thinking behind it. As you can look, what is that? Why would you jump that slowly? So most people don't jump in Virtua Fighter, which, like, it's hard to wrap your brain around. If you play a lot of fighting games, and grew up playing a lot of fighting games, I think games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, like you're jumping like crazy, especially when you're first learning those games. For Virtua Fighter, you're basically asking for death if you jump. Look at that! It's so silly. Virtua Fighter 1 is even worse. Like, you're in the air for such a long time. Okay. So right there, I just drank booze, because one thing about Shun is that he's a raging alcoholic, and is actually very lucky to be in his advanced age with no doubt a crippling cirrhosis ailment. But drinking makes him fight better. Well, it doesn't make me fight better in this game because Sarah keeps kicking my ass, but what are you going to do? So yeah, it's funny. Like I played Fighters Mega Mix on a previous edition of Saturnmania, and the models for the Virtua Fighter characters in that game don't look as good as this. If you do like a Pepsi Challenge 1-to-1 comparison, you can kind of tell right away. But in that game, you've got a million other characters, and a lot of those characters are very weird and memorable and stupid in all the best ways. So that more than makes up for it. But hey, at least everything's textured. You know, Virtua Fighter 1 famously has no textured polygons. Boom! Take that, Sarah. Usually, when I'm playing this game, I do lose at least once to Sarah. But that's because I enjoy Virtua Fighter from a distance, and always have. No, I never claim to be good at these games. I am more, my bread and butter is definitely more in the Capcom 2D fighters, SNK 2D fighters. 3D fighting games I think are incredibly fun. I enjoy them, but I've never been at the same level with those that I have been with 2D fighting games. And then not to say that I'm excellent at those games either, because I'm not. I can beat my friends who don't like fighting games pretty routinely. And that's it. And sometimes I don't, and I lose to them, and they rub it in. They say horrific things like, and I don't even respect these games. And then I'll go off into a bathroom and let out a few grown man tears, and then I'll move on with my day. Yeah, I think the scaling in these stages too looks so good. The one thing that they had to dial back on the Sega Saturn version of this game, obviously, is those backgrounds. Those backgrounds are one giant sprite layer. In the arcade game, they're actual 3D elements. They're polygonal elements. I mean, this is, after all, this is a Saturn, okay? The 3D capabilities of the system were kind of shoehorned in because Sega realized a little late in the game that, like, oh shit, we need to make 3D games too. And what's really, really remarkable about Saturn 3D is that they're not traditional polygons like on PlayStation or N64. Believe it or not, all of the 3D elements on the Saturn, they're made up of sprites, or these weird permutations of sprites. I've seen the term quadrilateral being thrown about in the internet. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know exactly the truth, but there's enough resources out there that say that the 3D on Saturn is not the same. And just by the look of these games, like, you can kind of infer that yourself. Because they do look different. The 3D is a little different. In some cases, the Saturn couldn't produce the same amount of polygons, or 3D elements, as the PlayStation. But when it did, like in this example for Virtua Fighter 2, these are like rock solid. If you look at old PlayStation games, especially like within the first 2 or 3 years of the PlayStation, they're warp all over the place. Like, they're nothing is like stationary about them. They're very weird. And in the Saturn, in some of these games that were developed at the highest levels, they're just rock solid. There's no warping or any of that stuff that the PlayStation was plagued with. So that's something that deserves to be shouted out a little bit, I think. Just a little. Alrighty. I think I'm gonna beat Pi here. I'm gonna wrap it up. Let's do a throw. If I can. Ah! Pi's another one. I always have trouble with Pi. Her kung fu is very strong. I mean, that is what it is. She was taught by her father, the evil Lao, who looks a whole lot like Lan Di from Shenmue. All right, whoever wins or loses, this is where we will call it. Oy! And yeah, it's gonna be pie. Yeah, it was pie. It was pie. Okay, let's do some of this and let's do this. So, Virtua Fighter 2, I think, is a classic video game. To me, it holds up well today. In that era of early 32-bit 3D games, I think Virtua Fighter 2 looks great. I mean, you just saw it there. It never did it falter from 60 frames a second. There are games that come out today on these fancy Dan newfangled 4K consoles that struggle to maintain 30 frames a second, let alone 60 frames a second. So, I mean, look, I'm not saying that Virtua Fighter 2 looks as good as Spider-Man 2 for PS5 in terms of sheer amount of on-screen polygons, obviously. But to me, it looks good. It holds up really well. It is one of the more iconic games for the system. I think that if the Saturn launched with Virtua Fighter 2, it would have helped get it into homes. That and the fact, what Sega really should have done, and this is obviously a hindsight thing, but the second Sony said our PlayStation is going to be $299, Sega should have been like, well, ours is now too. What are you going to do about it? That would have been something. That could have helped a little bit. But that just didn't happen. And I think that was a Sega of Japan call. And they're kind of famous for ruling the whole thing with an iron fist, for better or worse. So anyway, we wrapped up Saturnmania with one of the most iconic games on the Saturn in Virtua Fighter 2. And I have zero regrets about that. I will say, overall, to button it up, the Saturn, I think, is a great system. It was very much underappreciated in its time. And through things like YouTube and getting more eyes and attention on it, and obviously exposure to some of the other games that were available in other territories, it's kind of changed now into this thing where the Sega Saturn is like more of a beloved system than it used to be, and maybe then it actually has the right to be, if I'm honest, because I do think I love the Saturn. Don't get me wrong, but I think it failed for a lot of real reasons. There were a lot of mistakes made with this thing, but that doesn't take away from the library. There's really, really good games on the Saturn, and now with the Saru, it really opens the platform up. There are homebrew games being made on the Saturn, which is so exciting. I personally played like a 10-player version of Balloon Fight that someone made for the Saturn, and it was such a wild good time. It was so much fun. So that's one of the benefits of the Saturn getting more attention these days, is more people are being open to make games for it. And I'll tell you this, I think I mentioned this when I first mentioned the Saru on an older episode. If anyone makes a game and publishes a game on a cartridge for the Saturn, you're getting my money. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you make a Saturn cartridge game, I'm giving you my money for that. So I have put the seed out there. I have watered that seed. May it blossom into a beautiful flower with rings around it. But this is the Sega Saturn. It is one of my favorite systems of all time. It is the kickoff of this side crisis, which I have dubbed Saturnmania. And these are 5 of my favorite Saturn games. To recap, we did Fighters Megamix, we did Radiant Silvergun, we did X-Men vs. Street Fighter, we've done Astal, and now we've done Virtua Fighter 2. For me, I would say those are probably my favorite 5 Saturn games. If we expand this bad boy to 10, Guardian Heroes is going to be on there. I'm going to say Dragon Force is somewhere in that mix. There's a lot to love about the Saturn, and so I might return to it down the road. But for now, I'm real happy with the 5 games I chose. Hopefully, you've been inspired to go get a Saturn, get yourself a Saru, spend a little bit of time doing what needs to be done, because now, with how cheap the Saru is, you can get a Saturn for as of now, like you can get a Japanese one for like $100. Who knows how long that's going to last, because I'm sure the price on these systems is just going to go up. as the Saru becomes a better way to play games and keeps getting developed and more firmware and etc. So you might want to jump in now and get going. But hey, I'm not your boss, so you're going to do you. But this has been Saturnmania. I've had a blast doing this because I typically have a blast playing the Saturn. So please like and subscribe, leave comments, offer suggestions. Go check us out on Spotify. We're over there too. Leave a 5-star review. That helps. And yeah, I will return with another system. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. Like I said earlier, I might do PC Engine. I might do something that everyone knows, like the Genesis. I don't know. But it is fun for me to sit here and explore some of my favorite games. It gives you a chance to really dive into my taste. And for the dozens of you, that may be a thing that you're interested in. Or at the very least, I will wear funny shirts. So we always have that in the back pocket. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.